Hello, listeners, from Roy Damari of INSAM, telling you of the third in a series of five broadcasts about green cities, or the green city of Ekaterinburg in Russia. And this third of the five is devoted to buildings. Now, we can start by observing that densely populated cities are good for the environment in many regards. Already, cities are the powerhouse of economic development, which is partly why the cities are growing so much more than the countryside. But the high buildings, condominiums as they're called in North America, and apartment blocks, they're more efficiently and easily heated than individual houses. The public transport systems move people rather efficiently, and so that the overall environmental footprint of a dense city with high rises is better than a spread out sprawl. Besides, walking is healthy if it's relatively concentrated in terms of the centre of the city, but on the other hand, cities bring their noise and their air pollution, and they have heat islands as they absorb the sun's rays in concrete. But as cities are built or revamped with the environment in mind, then the buildings in them are also the focus of attention. And this research we've conducted looking at the Ekaterinburg example has shown that there's a whole movement underway to improve the environmental impact, including energy consumption, of buildings, particularly large public buildings, office blocks, and so on. And that's where standards come in, standards which few of us may have heard of. But these standards have spread throughout the world, and they are associated with a movement of green building councils, GBC, which encourage the application of the two standards I'm now going to describe briefly. They have green building councils in about 70 countries now, including Russia. Now, there are two international standards linked to certification systems for green buildings. Both are relevant for Russia and for the cities where you may live. The first was prepared in the United Kingdom back in 1990, and it carries the name BREEAM, and I'll spell out what that means. It stands for Building Research Establishment Environmental Assessment Methodology. It really trips off your tongue, doesn't it? And some years later, about 10 years later, in 2000, the Americans came up with their own standard, and they call it the LEED. That stands for Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. And that was unveiled in the USA in 2000. Now, the scope of both standards includes the energy balance of the building, the use of water, the health and the well-being of the occupants, how much pollution it might produce, issues of transport within the building, the materials used, how they evacuate the waste, the ecology of the building in terms of interaction with the outside world, and even the management processes of the building. And the buildings are rated and certified on a scale: pass, good, very good, excellent, or outstanding. Now, the content of the two standards is really pretty much the same. If there's a difference, it's in the approach to certification. It's the process by which a building is certified according to those words I just used, good and so on. BREEAM have taken the approach of licensing assessors, people, if you like, maybe companies too, who examine the evidence against the criteria laid down in the standard. They then report to the BREEAM parent, if you like, which is called the Building Research Establishment, or BRE, in the UK. BRE then assess the report and issue the certificate, provided all the requirements are met. LEED does it a bit differently. It does not collect the evidence. They leave it to the design team, made up, of course, of both architects and engineers, and urban planners and other professionals who are retained in a team by the builder or the developer. That design team then sends the data to the US-based Green Building Council, GBC, which examines them and issues a certificate of conformity if the design meets their demands. So the onus with LEED is on the design team, whereas with BREEAM, in a way, it's simpler because you've got a clear checklist, and the task of certification is more prescriptive with BREEAM and therefore less onerous. It incidentally offers less freedom in the design process. So you can take one or the other. They are a bit different, and for some it would be better to have LEED and the other for BREEAM. Now, obviously, a degree of adaptation to a country's climate and practices in general about building is required. You can't expect, even within a continent like North America, for everything to be the same. Windows designed to handle lots of sun in California or other southern states are not going to be very well suited to the northern climes of the northern part of the USA or of Canada. Now, in Russia, which has provided us with the example of Ekaterinburg in the Urals as a city adopting green principles, we cannot claim, the Russians couldn't claim, that they've been fast to adopt these green city ideas. They now do have a Green Building Council, and it's really quite active. It became a member of the World Green Building Council only in 2010. And they call it RUGBC, with a U little, the RUGBC. Now, it's quite active. It trains and implements compliance with both the standards BREEAM and LEED, and allows people to use the certification system, but it's on a voluntary basis. I mean, the Russian government isn't saying you must follow BREEAM and or LEED. In fact, Russian federal law has long required buildings to be designed and constructed in accordance with strict energy efficiency and with environmental protection codes and regulations. But in practice, the very cheapness of energy supply in Russia and the sheer abundance of natural resources, as well as weak enforcement of regulation, all this has meant very poor implementation. That is why the RUGBC is fighting to bring about changes, and they found a willing candidate as an example in Ekaterinburg. Now, one building has already gone up according to the LEED standard. I think there are some Americans behind the building. It's a business center and carries the name Tsvety, Tsvety, if anybody wants to look it up. So that's being built according to LEED. And that's important, but perhaps more important is that FIFA, that is, of course, sponsoring the World Cup, Football Cup, throughout Russia, and there are some matches in Ekaterinburg. Now, the stadium there was built back in the 1950s. It was probably ahead of its time then, but it has to be extended because there's a minimum size to the FIFA stadiums for the World Cup, and so extra seating has been put in by actually opening up the one end of the stadium and building a new stand with many new seats. The entire new standard is built outside the bounds of the original stadium, but the BREEAM standards have been applied to that new extension, and I think has been put back in to the old stadium in terms of its heating and energy consumption, lighting, using LED, for example, and water supplies. The FIFA, mixed with BREEAM building standards, generally focus on resource-efficient technologies, with stadiums or stadia constructed so as to preserve the architectural heritage and biological diversity of wherever they may be. They aim also at ensuring barrier-free environments for disabled people or people with limited mobility, and to create comfortable public spaces, and of course with all attention to safety of crowds, particularly if they get overexcited, as has been known, of course, in terrible disasters in the United Kingdom. There are some lessons to be taken from the Russian experience. First of all, standards are important. It is good to see them accepting the BREEAM and LEED standards, but they do need enforcement. Now, whether this enforcement should be by law or by the general pressure of the public and professional bodies, that can be debated. Unfortunately, people do not obey directly and simply policies and procedures laid down for them, and they might damage the grounds of buildings by walking where they want and damaging plantings, taking shortcuts and so on. And then we also have silly examples of the way people behave inside buildings. For example, air conditioning is often too cold. So what do people do? They bring in electric heaters in their own office. Wow, you pay energy to get rid of heat, then you put it back in again inefficiently with electric heating. Quite something. And then in winter, the building may be too hot, and people have to open windows and waste energy that way. Yet there are quite simple solutions, and the question left for thought rather than debate, as it were, over the radio, is should these solutions be spelt out in standards for general acceptance, and with an appeal to conscience or sense of people to follow them, or should the standards and solutions be imposed by some form of building inspectorate? It's a political question which we will not be answering in this broadcast. Next broadcast, I will be talking about outdoor furniture. Speak to you then.